You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. I can do those things because I'm not a hero. I'm whatever Gotham needs me to be.
They'll hunt you.
You'll hunt me. You'll condemn me. Set the dogs on me. Because that's what needs to happen. Because sometimes the truth isn't good enough. Sometimes people deserve more. Sometimes people deserve to have their faith rewarded.
I see why I'm getting irritated with this kind of stuff, right? With these arguments. Because it winds up you're doing way more work than the people that are trying to debate you. You're doing way more intellectual work than the people trying to debate you. And so the simple thing about explaining and citing your sources, how you came up with a theory, is pissing people off, right? Because they haven't done any work. They really haven't done any reading. They may read a page or even a paragraph, and they base their whole thesis on a page of the paragraph. Like, I'm hoping PK actually downloaded the paper, okay, instead of taking his thesis or his argument from one page. Because I went to JSTOR, and unless you have a link or yes, you have access, which I don't have university access, you can't read the whole document. And a lot of people like PK and others and Amiri will take a paragraph and base their whole argument off a paragraph instead of reading the whole work and then maybe highlighting a paragraph. So that means when they argue and they want me to argue it or me to explain it, that what it really means is they want me to do the work for them. And I got more than enough to do than trying to research for everybody. Unpaid research at that. This shit is time consuming. It's headache inducing. And just because you're up on a panel and you want to debate something, that's fine. You can give your opinion. I disagree, but. Okay, you disagree, but based on what? Well, I just have an opinion. Fine. Okay, you gave your opinion. But your opinion's wrong according to this, and this. But I still disagree. I don't care whether you disagree. Cite your sources. Because you're debating. You're not just talking. You're debating. I think. Okay, this is what you think. Back it up. Where'd you get it from? Anyway. Okay. This is from The Mothers by Robert Briefault, printed in 1931. Okay. In this particular paragraph, this particular chapter, chapter 7, and this is an excerpt. He actually, this particular book, he actually condensed his sections from the Matriarchy, because I think Briefault's whole work is in 3 volumes. I think it's like maybe over 1,000 pages, of which, trust and believe, I have not read the whole book. I got half of the book. I got part 1, man. Part 1 is like 400 pages. So unless you're really into this, I would say I wouldn't endeavor in it, because it's not a light work. It's not a light work. But we're going to endeavor this. We're going to humor this. We're going to humor some people. Okay, the position of women in matriarchal societies. The fact which we have considered appears to prove that the predominance of the male as husband and father, which characterizes historical patriarchal societies, did not exist originally in the constitution of human social groups, but is a result of comparatively advanced social conditions. As I was trying to argue, patriarchy, or what we think of is male-led societies, in a sense of what we have now, is relatively new. The brave and temperate objections which have been raised against the matriarchal theory of social origins would seem to arise. This is like I said, the idea or the argument that he's proposing is not new. Objections have been raised against the matriarchal theory of social origins would seem to arise largely from the misconception for which the term matriarchy is in part to blame, and which have been rendered more misleading by the manner in which matriarchal theory has been presented in the first instance from a superficial evidence of scattered indications. Matriarchy literally means ruled by the mother, in the same manner that as patriarchy means ruled by the father, and suggests therefore that a matriarchal type of society, the woman exercised domination over the men in a similar equivalent manner to that exercised by men over women in a patriarchal or social order. The two types of social organizations thus differing merely in the sex which wields dominant power in each. The speculations of Baclofen encourage that mis uh, misdominion in the picture of the kingdoms of women or realms of Princess Ida, in which the retrospective parts of sexes were reversed as a topsy-turvy world. That in particularly propitious, propitious circumstances, the maternal constitution of primitive human communities has remained preserved in advanced stages of culture and has led through the accumulation of material, has led, in other words, the maternal order has led to the accumulation of material property and political power in the hands of women, to something closely resembling such a gynocratic societies is possible and even probable. Gynocratic societies. Okay, even though I coined the term in this space, but as Sir James Fraser justly maintains, such conditions are exceptional cultural curiosities of little significance to the general history of culture. What, on the contrary, is of the profoundest significance for that history is that throughout the early stages of culture, it is not matriarchally constituted societies which are the exception, but on contrary, patriarchal constituted societies and families. In other words, patriarchal societies until recently were the exception and not the rule. Almost every variety and degree of feminine influence and power is to be found in the lower cultures, or the less advanced cultures. Sometimes considerable, as when superstition is invested in the woman, as I've said, with imaginary monopoly of magical and supernatural powers, sometimes amounting to little more than the status of a social equality with men, whether the women do or do not enjoy power and influence in a matriarchally constituted society. Their status is not in those societies defined by the specific disabilities which marks their position in a patriarchally constituted order. In other words, they're not the same. But the constitution of matriarchal societies is not a matter of domination of one sex over the other. It is convenient to continue to use the term matriarchy, which is established by usage, and although it is open to objection, so are other terms such as mother right or matrilineal society, which it has been sought to substitute for it. In other words, they've been arguing over this point, the use of the word, or the misuse of the word for a whole century or more, right? It's the use of the word. Now, the pattern or the society may have been misnamed, okay? And this is what he's arguing. What people are arguing over a name, and they've been arguing over this name for a long time. The accepted term is matriarchy, okay, of the pattern of the cultural phenomenon, how you organize families or societies. They have put this particular name on that pattern. That doesn't mean that the pattern has to conform to the word. If you say matriarchy, no matter what you think the definition should be, this is what it is, right? This is the accepted terminology when people think about a mother right or matrilineal or whatever, right? This is what he's saying. Or the mere practice of matrilineal reckoning. In point of fact, there is nothing in the lower phase of culture corresponding to the domination of one sex over the other, which characterizes patriarchal society. In other words, it didn't exist before the relatively modern patriarchal society. There is nothing in the most primitive human societies equivalent to the domination in which in advanced societies is exercised by individuals, by classes, and by rulers, right? The lower cultures are nothing if not equalitarian. The notion of domination is entirely foreign to primitive humanity. The conception of authority is simply not understood. The notion of privileged right has no place and no existence in those phases of culture. In other words, the need for dominating one sex over the other was not needed back then. The notion of privileged right has no place in existence in those phases of culture. When, therefore, the conception of feminine domination and of mother right is regarded as the characteristic of the maternal constitution of a patriarchal social organization, the ideas and principles of patriarchal society are imported into a social state which knows nothing about them. In other words, we're imposing what we think an order should be. And this is not females doing it, these are males doing it. And actually, the feminism is actually doing the same thing, right? And it can cause no surprise that the result is an improbable monster. Those misconceptions are characteristically instanced by Sir James Fraser's fundamental objection, as he conceives it to be, that chiefs are generally men. Okay? The objection loses some of its force when the fact is noted that in none of the lower phases of social organization are there any chiefs in our sense of the term. In other words, there are no kings. In other words, a chief is not a ruler. A chief is simply a ruler. A chief is simply a leader that is picked. So basically, the leader in a hunting and in war is a man because he must be a hunter and a warrior. But that position entails nothing analogous to what is habitually associated with the power and authority of a ruler. There is no such power and no such authority in the early stages of society. The power of the headman in war or hunting is extremely limited and ephemeral. It is like leadership among animals, purely functional, and no authority attaches to the office apart from its utility to the community. In other words, a leader or chief is pragmatic. They're there for a reason, right? They're there as a function. But rulership and ownership and all that kind of stuff is imposed upon a lower society. You're looking for something that's not there. You're trying to impose a pattern or an order in a primitive, what do you call a primitive society, an earlier society that's not there. But that position entails nothing analogous to what is habitually associated with the power authority of a ruler. There is no such power and no such authority in early stages of society. Power of the headman in war hunting is extremely limited. Wait a minute, I think I did that already. Thus, in Australia, where male domination is fully established and where the influence and authority of the older men is greater than most primitive communities, they have nevertheless no power. Among the Australian Aborigines, there are, properly speaking, no chiefs. The persons called by Europeans headmen are merely such delegates that may act as spokesmen, see that, in intercourse with the white men. In other words, the whole society picks a spokesman to actually speak for the whole. Actually, the whole is very, very democratic, male and female. It is more than doubtful whether any such institution existed before the arrival of Europeans. Where have we heard this before? Europeans, not feminists, but Europeans trying to impose their order, or what they think the order is, according to them. Australian headmen have no power to issue commands. They cannot act on their own initiative and personal authority. The collective action of the clan or tribe is governed by the influence of elder men, but there's no formal council. Even in a male-dominated clan, okay, he's saying there's no formal power. There's no formal order. And this is Australia. This is a male-dominated clan where men have outsized influence over the females. In northern Melanesia, the transacting of any official business with natives must be rendered very difficult owing to the fact they have no chiefs. In New Caledonia, Another center of male dominant, another center, these are all male dominated centers, right? That are not patriarchies. In New Caledonia, another center of male domination under the rudest conditions, the chiefs have no great influence and absolutely no political power. In the Banks Islands, in the Torres Straits Islands, there is no headman. In New Guinea, the chiefs have very little influence. Among the tribes of Assam, each village is a small republic. Each man is as good as his neighbor. Indeed, it would be hard to find anywhere else more thoroughly democratic communities. Headmen do exist, but their authority is very small. They are chiefs in name only. The Fujians, there are no chiefs. The medicine men are described by Captain Fitzroy as chiefs, but says Captain Both, they have no authority whatever. They are often as not derided and despised. The Patagonians owe no manner of allegiance to any head cacique. Cacique. I think that's, believe the name of that. These words are killing me. Their natural bias is to independence and rather insubordinate ideas of one man being as good as another. Commander Mustard's advice to future travelers among the Indians: don't give yourself airs of superiority, as they do not understand it. In the Indians of Brazil, reports an old missionary, know neither princes nor kings. Each family regards itself as absolutely free. Every Indian looks upon himself as independent. As the continual wars, that's where a lot of the so-called natural rights probably come from. Natural independence, as Europeans understand it. As the continual wars which they have to wage against their neighbors place their liberty in danger, they have learnt the necessity of forming a sort of society, and they choose a chief who's called a cacique. But in choosing him, their intention is not to give themselves a master, but a protector and father under whose guidance they desire to place themselves. In order to be raised to that dignity, it is necessary to have furnished striking proofs of courage and valor. The Iroquois and Delawares know no magistracy, laws, or restraint. Chiefs are nothing more than the most respected among their equals in rank. Their principal duties were to conduct negotiations with other tribes and with Europeans, to hold themselves responsible for carrying out of any agreement thus entered into. For a small mistake, they were severely reprimanded. In other words, the chief, as we like to think they are merely representatives, just like your House of Representatives, right? They are lawmakers, but the thing is, they're representatives, and they're severely punished if they make a mistake of not representing you in a democratic fashion. For any neglect of their duties were cashiered. They laugh when you talk to them of obedience to kings. A trader in the employment of the Hudson Bay Company relates the perplexity of the Indians when he spoke of the directors of the company as his chiefs. They asked, "Who are thy chiefs, and what makes them superior to other men?" He explained that their influence was owing to their great wealth. But the more I said in their praise, the more contempt I brought upon myself. And if I ever regretted anything in life, it was to have said so much. Several American tribes appointed chiefs in wartime only. The Sioux had no chiefs before the coming of Europeans. Among the carrier Indians, chiefs have not much authority or influence. Among the Navajos, chiefs are but elders, men of temporary and ill-defined influence, whom the youngest man in the tribe may contradict and defy. Among the Blackfeet, chiefs are described as occupying the position of beggars. The Eskimo, says Mr. J.W. Bilby, have no idea of authority except which one man may exercise over another, in virtue of his superior wisdom and experience, or skill, or strength. Skipping down, because I don't want to read all his examples. The authority and privileges of the male headman is, in matriarchal communities, even more insignificant than other primitive societies. Among the Seri, the chief appears to exercise scarcely any other function than to communicate desires and decisions of the matrons to the men. He is not chosen with regard to his own qualifications, but to those of his wife. Pueblo Indians had no chiefs. The Kashis of Assam show no particular courtesy of bearing towards their Rajas. Indeed, the latter do not seem to have much power. They have the right of calling on all to bear arms to send a contribution in case of war. In the olden day, their function was that of war leaders. They can perform no act of importance without consulting and obtaining the approval of the Durbar upon which the matrice sits. In other words, they had to go to get the approval of the women to actually declare a war or anything of importance. They're a very impecunious set of persons. The Kairim, which appears to have retained a more primitive constitution than other tribal districts, the chieftainship is limited to the male relatives of the high priestess, who controls their administration. Right? This is what Egypt was about. The pharaoh is limited to the male relatives of the whoever the head bitch in charge was, through a maternal line. That's how women controlled who was in charge. They picked who was in charge. Just like we pick a president. Among the Pilo Islanders, the authority of male chiefs is exercised over the men only. Women do not even salute them, right? In other words, he's there to keep the men in line. They can take no action without consulting the Council of Matrons. In fact, I think the Native Americans have a Council of Matrons. When an important decision has to be arrived at, the chief is shut up in his house in the company of several of the elder women who assist the potentate in making up his mind. It cannot be supposed that those communities in the nailless authority of the chiefs has been forcibly and arrogantly seized by the men. The women's authority and influence is paramount. They command every means and every avenue of power. Chieftainship is purely functional. What authority is attached to it is exercised over the men, not over the women, and is subject to the will of the latter. That sounds like the fucking black community, does it not? They pick men to check the men, okay? These guys don't come in and check the women. That's why you see this shit, right? That's why you see the stuff going on about the black, the black male YouTube sector, right? The black manosphere. It's not women trying to come in and check the men. They're picking other men to come in and check the men. They're picking their leaders to come and check the men. The position of male chiefs in primitive social groups is whether matriarchal, patriarchal, far from constituting it a difficulty as regards the matriarchal theory of social origins. It appears, on the contrary, to be irreconcilable with the hypothesis that human society first arose in groups formed around the authority of a dominant male. See, that's the problem that we're having, the theory of the dominant male. The visionary conception of the primitive patriarchal group dominated by an old male wielding despotic authority is radically incompatible with the equalitarian character which is everywhere the most conspicuous feature of existing primitive societies. And it is impossible to suppose that had the earliest human societies originated as patriarchal theory postulates, the state of things which is found to be the rule in lower cultures could not have ever developed out of the opposite conditions. In other words, your theory was right about patriarchal rule and father rule or father-led societies were true, then it would have evolved differently. You wouldn't get what you've seen or still seeing in what we call primitive societies, right? And it is impossible to suppose that had earliest human beings originated in patriarchal postulates the state of things in which we found in ruling lower cultures could not ever develop out of the opposite condition. The patriarchal theory in this respect is, in many others, an anachronism, which imputes to primitive social conditions what appertains to a much later states of cultural history. In other words, they're trying to map on what we think of a social order should be on past history. And these are men. PK kept saying it was feminism. It's not feminism. It's actually men. And men before feminism was actually created. Where military power has developed, the war leader and the warrior class have aggregated a domination which was naturally exercised in the first instance over conquered people and became extended by usurpation of privileges over their own tribes. But those conditions which we come upon in African kingdoms where empires are as vast as those of the ancient East were formally established has nothing to do with primitive conditions or the lower phases of social culture. Nowhere are the features characteristic of primitive matriarchal constitutions of society are more clearly apparent than in the principles in which even the most despotic masculine autocracies regulate the office of the royal ruler. That office was, until quite recently in our own society, the only political function which might be exercised by a woman. In other words, the queen, a royal ruler. That earlier phase of human societies were not organized in a patriarchal but on matriarchal principles was first suggested by the prevalent practice of recognizing descent to the female and not the male line. In other words, that is the key feature of a matriarchy, which I've said. If you see that, how it's recognized through descent of a female line, that by definition, according to how they define the word, is a matriarchy. Classical example of usage is the account given by Herodotus of the practice of the Lycians in Asia Minor. Herodotus. Okay, PK, that's well before feminism, okay? They have, he says, a singular custom, I think that's singular, which no other people have, for they take their names after their mother and not after their father. If a Lycian be asked who he is, he will recite his genealogy of his mother's side, reckoning up to his ancestry from mother to mother. Is that not the black community? That tracing of descent in the female line, which Herodotus thought singular, is known to be the rule of which about half the people of the world below the most highly developed stages of culture, and with most of those people who reckon descent in a paternal line, clear evidence exists that the opposite rule formerly obtained amongst them also. In other words, according to them, whether it is patriarchal, quote unquote, or matriarchal, depends on whose line of descent it follows, right? Patriarchal, right? Patriarchal, matriarchal, okay? According to them, that's the most important key factor. Not who rules, not who represents, where's the power representative through what lines. That's why the children take the father's name in a patriarchal society, quote unquote. Even though how Europeans think of a patriarchy has nothing to do with this. The thing is, if we want to map onto something, this is how it's determined, a paternal order versus a maternal order. With most people of those people recognizing descent in paternal line, clear evidence shows that the opposite ruled formally amongst them is also the practice which first suggests that the position of women is formally different from which they can occupy in a patriarchal organized society. Does not imply that their position was in any sense dominant, and no great difficulty is found showing that a matriarchal constitution of society cannot be inferred from the practice of matrilineal reckoning of descent. But it is quite otherwise with the practice of matrilocal marriage. For whether interpretations may be placed upon the origin of the custom, there can be no dispute as to its effects. When a woman, instead of following her husband, remains in her own house in the midst of her high blood relations, while the husband is more or less a stranger within the gate, or is accounted as a member of her family instead of the woman being transferred to his, it is obvious that the wife occupies the position of advantage entirely different from that in which she holds in a patriarchal society. However, civilized, and that her status cannot be one of subjection. Here, Adriani remarks that among the Teradajas of the Middle Celebes, owing to the woman remaining in her own house and in the midst of her own relatives, the husband's position is always that of one of subordination. The whole organization of the Zuni society, remarks Dr. Krober, is founded upon the continued residence of the woman in her home. Attached to her ownership of the Zuni woman's position in her world. Upon her permanent occupancy of her house rests the matrilineal custom of the tribe. The arrangement postulates, for one thing, that landed property, when it comes to be of value, is held by the woman, and that the husband is economically destitute but for the daily produce of his labor. In other words, men don't own anything in this society. According to society, ownership of things, children, property, money, descent, just like in a patriarchal society in Europe, as we described, it's ownership, legal ownership. That is the difference between a patriarchy, father rule versus mother rule. All the other stuff is varying degrees, but that defines it. This is a matriarchy, right? This is the definite key of a matriarchy, because that is what patriarchy is based upon, right? Even amongst the Etruscans, the Romans, and the Greece, okay? Ownership, children, money, property, that kind of stuff is legally conferred through one sex or the other. If it's conferred through a man, which is a paternal order or patriarchy, as we would like to call it, his ownership of the children, money, property, and stuff like that is conferred legally through him. In a matriarchy, that's where the opposite is. It has nothing to do with rulership, right? Everybody wants to look at who is the head, but this is where the power is, right? That's why they're pointing it out. That's where the power is. That confers the matriarchy. And it also follows that such property is transmitted. Say it with me, church. Say it with me, church. It also follows that such property is transmitted in the female line, and that the children are part of the group of the mother and not the group of the father belongs. Ownership, the custody of infants, ownership. That's what differs between a matriarchy and a patriarchy. Ownership, not rulership as you would like to call it. Now, the person at the head has very little influence, right? On the ground, functionally, who owns what? That's what the women in Northern Europe were actually protesting against. Ownership. Patriarchal lines mean that the father owns what? I've said that from the very beginning. Who owns the children? Who owns the children? Not who sits at the head, who represents the people. Everybody else is a representative. Our representative government, republic, the president represents the people. The people have the power. How are things organized, right? Who owns what? That's the real power, ownership. And I'm going to do a little bit more of this, and we're going to stop because this is getting kind of long. Motherfuckers need to do their goddamn research. In Dalmatia, even in the last century, it was customary when a woman owned land, even now, when a woman owned land, that her husband who came to live with her should change his family name and assume that of the wife. Thus, the children took the family name of the mother and not of their father. The reckoning of descent through female does not necessarily imply a matriarchal type of society. Matrilocal marriage does. Ooh, my goodness. Matrilocal marriage does. Accordingly, while we may find many matriarchal features existing where marriage is patrilocal, it is exceedingly exceptional to find a patriarchal customs associated with established practice of matrilocal marriage. A lot, we're actually gonna. He actually did a section of matrilocal marriage. We're gonna do one more paragraph, and we're gonna bid this one goodbye. I might do, if people want a part two, we might do a dive into matrilocal marriage. This book is quite interesting. That's why they call this the Bible. If you really want to understand matriarchy as a concept, I think he spent 30 years collecting this stuff, right? 20 or 30 years collecting this stuff. Briefold is the Bible as far as matriarchy versus patriarchy. If you haven't read him, then, and I haven't read all of his stuff, I might do it because I really wasn't that interested in this crap, right? But the thing is, Briefold is considered the Bible. Even MGTOWs, as patriarchal and as obstinate as they are, they consider Briefold the authority on this kind of subject, right? Whether domination is or is not exercised by the woman in a matriarchally constituted society is neither a character which can serve as a basis for scientific discussions, nor one which can easily be estimated. The wildest differences of judgment are apparent in estimates of relative influence of the sexes, even in definitely patriarchal societies. Many opinions could be cited to the effect that the woman enjoyed unusual freedom and exercised marked influence in Victorian or Georgian England. There existed no doubt genuine grounds for these estimates. A patriarchal husband may quite well be a henpecked husband. Conversely, the men in a matriarchally organized society may be bullies. Nevertheless, the social constitution of Victorian England was strenuously patriarchal, and that of the Iroquois was definitely matriarchal. The influence of women in any society varies, as one might expect, enormously in different cultures, but the point of fact, in none of the lower cultures is the position of women equivalent to that which they occupy in a patriarchal constituted society. In other words, no matter how you slice it, a patriarchy is vastly different than what existed, what came before it. So you can't compare patriarchy to anything else because it's its own thing and it's relatively new. We may dive into that. We may or may not dive into that. I haven't decided because, man, I got other shit I got to read. I ain't got time to debate this crap over and over. The only reason I actually want to do this kind of line of questioning, line of thinking, because I actually want to identify the roots of feminism. I don't want to go all the way back for 100,000 years to debate matriarchy versus patriarchy, how you organize people, because how you organize people depends on the environment that you're in. Even patriarchy arose because of a different order. When property came, and he said this earlier in the book, right? When property came in, the knowledge or the idea of property, private property came into existence is a social phenomenon. That's when you start to see the rise or the development of patriarchy. Even with that, it came late. But for all you niggas out there that want to debate, before you come debate me, okay, study your material, as my spiritual teacher used to tell me. You got to study your material. Don't come in with this half-ass I think. If you can't walk in and at least give me the book or give me a synopsis of the source of which you read, don't come in with this bullshit. What I think. And half the time, you motherfuckers come in what I think and read the shit and don't even read it properly. So how you get what you think out of this? Y'all come in with bullshit arguments. Either you're going to be a scholar to the work or you're not. If you're not going to be a scholar to the work, back off and let the people that actually read this dry ass shit do what they do. And if you want to come in and debate it, you get off your ass and read the dry ass shit. That's what I got frustrated with PK last night, right? Because cite your source. And all you can give me is a half a page. And that's what you riff off of after I've done 3 fucking months of work and you want to argue? Get the fuck out of here. Anyway, with that, I'm going to bounce off of here. This is BGS out, and I will see you guys on the next one. Peace.